Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Today we're going to be going over an extended line in the Caro Kann, and it's the fantasy variation. So it starts out with pawn e4, c6, pawn here to d4, and then pawn d5. This is the Caro Kann, and the fantasy variation that we're going to be going over is pawn here to f3. It's pretty exciting. It does have, weakness for white along this g1 here to a7. So the dark square bishop for black could definitely be a factor. Dark square bishop would like to be here on, let's say c5 or b6 and kind of hone down on that weakness for white. So white definitely has to, keep in mind that that's there. Also is blocking off this knight here to f3, so if this pawn would move away, that would be fantastic for white, or you could always play something like knight here to e2, or even a knight here to h3 and then move it back here to f2 and try to help control this pawn here on e4. But a lot of different variations that black can kind of go into. You could always play the solid pawn here to e6. Looking forward to later on playing pawn here to g6, being Caro on the king side. Maybe later on play something like pawn here to c5, trying to stretch the queen side and kind of attack those dark squares. So after the trade-off, the queen or the bishop can come down here to c5, as we talked about. Really attack that weakness that white has right here. You also may see black just take right here on e4. This is pretty common. White has two responses. He can always take back with his pawn. You can always play something like knight here to c3. So we're going to, in this video, kind of talk about some of the main lines that you'll see, some of the key concepts, and really how to attack against the Caro Kann with the fantasy variation. And the first line we are going to talk about is when d captures here on e4. Now, as we just discussed, white has two different options. The first line we're going to go over is if the pawn takes here on e4. This is probably the most common that you should play. It's a little more solid, and black has a lot of different ways to fall into many different traps. So if we're kind of going off of a recommended, I think this plays very well. It also allows you to play knight here to f3 later on, not worrying about this pawn on f3 staying there. As we'll talk to later on, you always could play knight to c3, hoping that they play kind of this pawn to f3, and then if you do end up with knight here to f3, this is fine. But a lot of times after this move, your opponent doesn't end up taking here on f3. So always solid if white just takes here on e4. Black really has limited number of moves that he can do here. We're going to kind of go over some of the most common ones. He really should play something like pawn here to e5, striking the center of the board. White can't just capture here on e5, and white's not really too concerned about the queen coming down here to d1 and then black recapturing, because after the queen comes off the board, white's not too worried about his king not being able to castle. What white's more concerned about is the queen coming here to h4 checking, and then this is just a whole lot of bad news. Doesn't really matter if the pawn comes here to g3 to stop it, or if the king comes up and moves e2 or even d2. The queen can just come here to e4, and that's definitely going to be bad news for white. So instead, white cannot recapture. Instead, white's going to play right here on f3. Again, he really wants to get his knight involved into the game. Great square for that. Now he can get his light square bishop. He can castle on the king side. He has the semi-open file for his rook once he can get it here to f1. So this knight move on f3 is really the only option. It gives white so many different lines that he can attack with. So if we kind of look at this, black has a few options from here. The first one that we may see is pawn takes here on d4, trying to kind of just break up the center of the board that white has. He's really dominating with both his d and his e pawn right here. White could recapture. He does have a defender with his knight here on f3, but really that's not white's goal here. His goal is to set up a monster attack, and so we have bishop coming here to c4. And really, this is the best move. It really allows your opponent to hang himself. There's so many different ways that black can get into trouble. If we kind of look at it, what are the most common moves that you may see, from black right here? One of them would be, bishop coming to g4. And so this seems pretty standard. You see from a lot of players getting a light square bishop involved into the game, pinning down this knight right here. But the bishop can now just come to f7 check, and then after the king comes here to f7, then knight here to e5 check, and there's a discovered attack on the bishop here on g4. Now, the king doesn't have to take, but even after the king comes here to e7, then we have the bishop coming here taking on g8, and now black can't even respond with taking with his rook, because if he takes with his rook, then the bishop can come here to g5 check, and the queen's going to fall. So this is just all sorts of bad news for black if we kind of look at it. So the bishop here to g4, definitely that's going to be a trap. Another move that you may see is the bishop coming here to c5, trying to control this c5 pawn right here. And again, this is going to be completely fine. White's not too worried about all the material right away. He's really just trying to launch a solid attack right now. So white can just respond by castling on the king side. Later on he can, if the knight comes here to f6, then we can see something like knight here to g5, and this really opens up the door for this semi-open file for the rook right here. Next move you can see something like pawn here to e5. Again, there's now an attack. Both the bishop and the knight here are both attacking the pawn here on f7. So many different ways that the white can really attack right now, and black is just kind of sitting there trying to figure out, okay, yeah, he's got a bishop that's attacking or protecting this pawn, but he's just not doing too much beyond that. Next variation we're going to go over is, let's say the pawn doesn't take here on d4, but instead the bishop first comes here to g4. White's immediately going to play bishop to c4 just as before, laying the trap. If the pawn comes here to d4, right away looking to take here on f7. Same kind of setup as before. If the pawn doesn't take, could play something like knight here to f6. Still going to swing in for the trap here. Bishop takes on f7. Same kind of thing. If the king takes, we're going to play knight here to e5. Discovered attack. Not going to take with the queen since the knight's right here, but the knight can take here on g4 if he wants to, and then the queen can swoop in and recapture depending on what black does. White could always castle on the king side as well, which would open up the door for a check as well. So that's one option. But if the king doesn't take, let's say he plays king here to e7, it's going to be a little bit different because the bishop's not going to come to g8. There's no knight for it to take. Instead, the bishop's going to come back here to b3. And this is super important because this bishop's just going to be a pain in the side of black. He doesn't have his d pawn, which really would block this off. And since his pawn on the e file, if he played it here on e6, this would kind of stop it. But since he's kind of pushed it up to e5, that's going to be very good because there's really no way for black to really stop all this pressure that white has here on b3. So what's black really going to do here? White has all of his pieces. His black king right here on e7 is not going to be safe the rest of the game, and white's just going to continue to put a lot of pressure on black. Black could fall for another trap. It could play something like knight takes on e4 and then queen here to e2, just putting too much pressure. If this knight moves, the queen can just come here to e5, capture, and then it's check. Also, the bishop could come here to g5, checking the king, pinning. It's being pinned down to the queen right here on d8. And again, even if the knight moves and takes on g5, the queen could come here and take on e5. White could also castle on the king side. Again, just having this entire open file for his rook to dominate on the f file is really tough to deal with. If we come back, if black doesn't make a mistake, because knight to f6 would be a mistake, he could play something like knight here to d7. White's just going to castle on the king side. Again, this is going to be good for him. He can get his dark square bishop involved into the game now if he wants to play something like knight to c3. He's just putting a ton of pressure on black. Black has at least 3 more moves before he can castle on the king side. It's a little bit too unsafe to castle on the queen side right now. So white can still, again, add a ton of pressure to the game. Now, there's a lot of other options that black has. It could try something like queen to b7 or b6. This is going to be a mistake because, again, bishop can just swing in here to f7 check. Again, there's nothing good that's going to come of this from black. Could also see something like the bishop coming here to b4, but it's just not going to stop a lot. Just pawn here to c3 just kind of stops that. Then the bishop moves back. and then really just white gained another move in the game, and so that's not really what black wants to do. So this is not going to be good for black any way you look at it. The next variation we're going to look at is, let's say the pawn doesn't come to e5, which is the most common. Let's say something like knight to f6. Again, if we're kind of looking at all the different moves that black could play, doesn't have too many, but knight to f6 seems pretty common. White's immediately just going to play pawn to e5. Not too many great squares, from black that he could really play. If you play something like knight here to e4, white can just continue his development. Just pretend like this knight's not even there, because it's not really posing any huge threats right now. If he plays, kind of the more common move of knight here to d5, since it is kind of protected, a nice little outpost right here, white can just continue to put pressure. So something like pawn here to c4. The knight's not really going to go anywhere now. C7's pretty bad, kind of blocking off, not really doing a whole heck of a lot. Something like knight here to b6. It's still pretty passive, and then you have knight here to f3. White's just controlling the center of the board. His piece is a little more clearly defined as far as what they're doing. It's not really clear how black's going to respond in this situation. So again, definitely going to be good for white in this case. If instead something else you may see knight here to d7, which is fine. White can just respond with knight here to f3. Again, there's just not a lot of good moves for black. He's going to have a really cramped game from here. Could try something like g6, trying to fianchetto on the king side. White can immediately just come here, bishop here to c4. Again, this is a critical square. Since this d pawn is gone, bringing your bishop here to c4 is going to pose a lot of threats on your opponent. After, bishop here to g7, white can castle on the king side. Again, black's just not really stopping anything that white's doing. White's going to have a very, very good game from here. Again, as we said earlier, white doesn't have to take here on e4. Instead, he could play something like knight to c3, kind of baiting his opponent to play knight or pawn takes here on f3. White would really like this situation right here. He's controlling the center of the board. He has both of his minor pieces involved into the game. His opponent doesn't have to take. He could always play something like knight here to f6. Doesn't really matter. White's going to take here on e4. We kind of have this looking setup, which is a little bit different, but next white could look to play something like knight to f3, then get his bishop here to c4. A lot of the same fundamentals as before, except the knight starts here on c3. We're going to talk a lot, though, if the pawn does take on f3, and then the knight could recapture here on f3. Some of the things you may see, one would be knight to f6 right here. Again, pretty common. White's immediately going to play bishop here to c4, and then look to castle on the king side. So is attacking this f7 pawn. You could see e6, and then castling on the king side. This is pretty common for white. Another option you may see from black is to fianchetto on the king side. So seeing this pawn here on d4, that's really only the mid pawn that white has, and so trying to counter attack hyper-modern defense, trying to control the center with his minor pieces, and fianchetto with his bishop here to g7, and again attacking those dark squares that white's trying to control right now. White's just going to play bishop here to c4, pretty constant theme. This pretty easy variation to understand because white is going to be doing the same thing over and over. And it's very important as far as the next few moves. If bishop here to g7, then you could play bishop here to g5, putting more and more pressure. Both of these bishops, this bishop pair is putting a lot of pressure, so this pawn no longer can move here on e7. If we have knight coming to f6, then knight to e5 is really, really dangerous for black, as far as white can castle on the king side if he wants to. White's putting pressure on this pawn on f7, so if black wants to stop it, one move he could try is black comes to e6, but then after the exchange right here, white castles on the king side. Very, very good position for white. If instead the pawn comes up here, instead of bishop to e6, you have the pawn coming here to e6, then the rook can swing over here to f1. Doesn't even have to castle on the king side if he doesn't want to, because the queen can get involved later, and then castle on the queen side if he wants to. So this is going to be very good for white as well. Now if we come back over here, and instead of the bishop coming to g7 first, if we see something like knight here to f6. This would kind of be more of a mistake, but now you could see the knight coming here to e5 right away. Again, both attacking the pawn right here, and then we could see, you know, the bishop take and then castle on the king side. This is going to be a little bit better for white because the bishop is not here right away. And then again, if we come back and same kind of thing, if the pawn comes here to e6 right away, then the rook can swing over. And then now when the bishop comes over to g7 to try to protect this knight, he's down a move, whereas before his bishop was already here on g7. He's kind of down a move, and then it's just a matter of everyone putting all their pieces trying to defend this knight here on f6. And so you know, if the king castles on the king side, then we have the queen come over here to f3, and there's just too much pressure on this knight right here on f6. And again, now white can castle on the queen side, get his other rook involved, and just storm his pawns up on the king side. There's really nothing good that black can really do. It's going to be very hard to get his other knight involved into the game. His other rook is just going to be sitting there the rest of the game. And again, his light square bishop is now blocked off because this pawn on e6 is kind of blocking it. So all of these are going to be very, very good for white. The last variation we're going to go over is probably one of black's more solid lines. And it's if he plays pawn here to e6. And it kind of has that Slav feel if you're familiar with the Slav defense. You know, with your pawns here, you know, c6, d5, and e6 right here. It's more of a passive defense. It's not really committing thing right away. It does also take away some of white's attacking. You know, white really wants to play something like bishop here to z4, but that's completely blocked off. So this is why, again, this is one of more of the solid ways to defend against the fantasy variation. White's now going to respond with knight to c3, which isn't super common, but again, this pawn here on f3 is kind of stopping the knight to come right here, and so he really wishes that the pawn would take, but you know, the pawn on e6, now it's going to be more of a slower game. There's not going to be any crazy tactical lines as we talked about before. A few different ways that, you know, black can respond. If he takes now with his pawn, this is going to be completely fine. White looks to retake. Horrible position for black, actually, giving up the d pawn here and then just having a pawn on c6 and e6, and white really controls the center of the board. You don't see that too often. You may sometimes see, you know, the bishop coming down here to b4, trying to pin down the knight to the king right here. You could now just play knight to e2, again protecting this knight. You may not want to play your bishop here to d2, blocking off the queen, because you may want to get your queen somewhere to like d3 if you want to. But the knight's, again, not going to be doing too much with the pawn here on f3, so this is going to be completely fine. Again, you could see something like knight here to f3, and then you could just swing up your queen here to d3. Going to be completely fine. Again, adding another defender on this pawn here on e4, that's going to be fine. If we come back, instead of, you know, the bishop coming down here to b4, something else you could see is, you know, knight to f6, immediately going to be met by pawn here to e5. And then, you know, there's no great square for this knight. He could, if he comes back, that's obviously going to be horrible. He just lost an entire move, and white controls the board even more. If he plays, you know, d7, white could solidify with pawn here to f4. Later on, just play knight to f3, and then really just try to cramp black style. Could also play something, you know, knight here to h5. That's going to be fine. White's not really too worried about it. There's nothing black can really do. So white can just continue, you know, bishop here to e3, get his queen involved into the game, castle on the queen side. He's not really moving his other pieces too much. There's no great square for his bishop right away. So castling on the queen side looks a lot better for white in this position. Some horrible moves that you may see from black after, you know, pawn here to e6, and then immediately knight here to c3. You could see something like pawn here to c5. Again, it makes somewhat sense because eventually black would want to play something like c5, but it's probably a little bit too soon. The pawn can take here on d5, and then after this, the pawn recaptures on c5, and now white has both a knight and a queen looking down at this pawn here on d5, and white's going to go up in material because even after, you know, the bishop comes, you know, white's just going to be up in material because the queen can just immediately take here on d5. So That's definitely going to be a bad move, not what black really wants to be doing. Although later on, once he develops a little bit more, he would try to play something like, pawn here to b5 and try to extend on the queen side, since he's going to have a pretty safe king side after he gets his dark square bishop and his knight involved into the game. Last thing you may see is, queen here to b6, putting pressure not only on this pawn on d4, but also this pawn on b4, or this pawn on b2. So if the bishop goes anywhere, could immediately just come down and take this material. From here, I can play pawn here to a5. A few different moves that you could play, but I like pawn a5 again, kind of countering the move from black on the queen side, and really just forcing them to do something. Could also come down here to b4, threatening this knight here on c3. White can just respond with his bishop here to e3, putting another defender on the pawn on d4, and he's not as worried about the pawn here on b2. It really depends on how black goes about it. Again, if the knight comes to f6, you're always just going to play pawn here to e5. So again, from that e6 move early on, there's not that many crazy lines, because again, it's that the Slav defense is just really just locked down. It's very solid, but it's more of a slow, methodical game, and not these crazy lines where you hope your opponent falls into these different types of traps. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this variation. I had a lot of requests to kind of go into deeper variations, even for some of the more common openings like the Caro Kann. So hopefully y'all enjoyed, and let me know what you think, and I'll see you on the next video. Thanks for watching.